The wind howled across the prairie like a banshee-given voice, a mournful, ceaseless cry that scraped at the windows of Thomas's small cabin and clawed at the frozen earth outside. It was a winter that seemed determined to break the world, to strip it bare and bury it under drifts of unforgiving white. Thomas had seen harsh winters before, lived through them, endured them, but this one felt different. It mirrored the landscape inside him, a frozen wilderness where nothing grew, nothing bloomed. He was a man carved from the same rough, unyielding material as the land he wrestled a living from. His hands were calloused, his face lined not just by sun and wind, but by a grief that had settled deep within him, like stones at the bottom of a well. 3 years it had been since the fever had claimed his wife and their 2 young sons. 3 years since the silence in the cabin had become a physical presence, heavy and suffocating. He had built this life out here, away from the ghosts of his old one, hoping the sheer scale of the sky and the punishing labor of ranching would somehow fill the void. It hadn't. The emptiness remained, a constant, aching companion. His days were a monotonous cycle of survival: chop wood, feed the scrawny cattle, repair fences the wind had ripped apart, huddle by the fire, sleep. There was no laughter here, no soft touch, no shared word. He spoke mostly to his horse, sometimes to the dog, but mostly just to the wind, letting it carry away the fragments of thoughts he dared not hold on to for long. The nearest settlement was a day's ride away, a place he visited only when absolutely necessary for supplies, a place filled with faces that held pity or suspicion, or worse, indifference. He preferred the company of the wind. It made no demands, asked no questions, offered no empty comforts. It simply existed, cold and relentless, much like his own existence. He was lost in the familiar haze of this solitude one biting afternoon, splitting logs by the woodpile, the rhythm of the axe a dull, percussive beat against the vast silence, when he saw it. A dark shape against the swirling white, far out on the eastern edge of his property, where the flat land began to roll into shallow, snow-choked gullies. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind playing tricks with the snow. It was too still, too human-shaped. He stopped, axe mid-swing, the sudden cessation of movement amplifying the shriek of the wind. His heart, usually a steady, quiet thrum, gave a hard, unfamiliar lurch. Nobody came this way. Not in this weather. Not ever. Unless they were lost or looking for trouble. Trouble was something Thomas avoided. He had had his fill of it. He watched for a long moment, the biting cold forgotten as a different kind of chill settled over him. The shape didn't move. It was small, huddled. Curiosity, a long-dormant emotion, stirred within him, fighting against the ingrained caution of years lived alone on the frontier. He was a solitary man, not a heartless one, not yet, anyway. Dropping the axe, he went inside, grabbed his heavy coat, rifle, and stuffed some jerky and a waterskin into a satchel. The old dog, a mangy hound named Rusty, whined softly by the door, sensing the shift in his master's routine, the tension in his stance. "Stay, boy," Thomas murmured, his voice raspy from disuse. Stepping back out into the maelstrom, he pulled his hat low and started walking towards the shape, the snow crunching under his boots, the wind tearing at his clothes. The visibility was poor, the snow a thick curtain, but he kept the dark form fixed in his sight. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself, horrifyingly. It was a person, collapsed face down in the snow, a smaller bundle clutched protectively beneath them. A wave of something akin to dread washed over him. He approached cautiously, rifle held ready, scanning the empty horizon. There was no sign of horses, no tracks other than the faint ones leading to the collapsed figure, already blurring under the falling snow. He reached them, kneeling stiffly in the deep drift. It was a woman, her worn hide clothes soaked and plastered to her body. She was young, her hair dark and braided, unmistakably native. And clutched against her chest, bundled in a thin, inadequate blanket, was a baby. The woman's skin was unnaturally pale, tinged with blue. She was barely breathing, shallow, ragged gasps that seemed to tear at her frozen lungs. The baby was quiet, too quiet, its tiny face hidden against her breast, but he could see the slight rise and fall of the bundle. It was alive. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Thomas's practiced stoicism. This was not a stray animal, not a lost traveler he could point towards the nearest town. This was a woman and a child, freezing to death on his land. This was a responsibility he hadn't sought, didn't want, and was ill-equipped to handle. His first instinct, raw and selfish, was to turn away, to pretend he hadn't seen them. They were native, strangers, vulnerabilities he couldn't afford in a world that already felt precarious enough. But the baby was so small. And the woman's grip, even in her unconscious state, was fierce, an instinctual shield against the elements. He saw something familiar in that protectiveness, a ghost of the fierce love he had felt for his own lost children. The thought was like a sharp shard of ice in his chest. He couldn't leave them, not a mother and a child, not even in this unforgiving place, not even when his heart felt like a block of ice itself. Putting his rifle aside, he carefully tried to lift the woman. She was heavier than she looked, limp and unresponsive. It was awkward in the deep snow. The baby, a fragile burden, still pressed against her. He knew he couldn't carry them both back to the cabin through the drifts. He had to move fast. With immense effort, he managed to shift the woman onto his shoulder, supporting her weight. The baby was still cradled against her. He turned and began the difficult trek back towards the cabin, fighting the wind, breaking trail through the snow, the cold biting through his clothes, the weight of the woman and the silent, unseen baby heavy on his shoulder and heavier still on his conscience. "This changes everything," a voice whispered in his mind, a voice that sounded suspiciously like the wind. Reaching the cabin felt like an eternity. His muscles screamed, his lungs burned, and the cold seeped into his bones. He stumbled through the door, letting the woman slide gently to the floor near the fire, being careful not to jostle the baby. Rusty came forward, sniffing cautiously, then lay down a respectful distance away, watching with intelligent eyes. Thomas knelt beside the woman, his hands trembling slightly as he unbundled the baby. It was a girl, impossibly small, wrapped in layers of thin, inadequate fabric. Her face was pale, her lips blue, but her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. She stirred faintly, letting out a weak, reedy whimper that tore at something deep inside him. A baby's cry. It had been so long. He looked at the woman. She was young, perhaps barely 20, her face etched with exhaustion and hardship even in repose. He needed to get her warm, get the baby warm. He worked quickly, stripping off her wet outer layers, wrapping her in dry blankets from his bunk. He did the same for the baby, swaddling her carefully in soft wool. He had no idea what else to do. He was a rancher, a solitary man, not a doctor, not a midwife, not a rescuer. He built the fire up higher, the flames leaping and casting flickering shadows on the walls. The cabin grew warmer, the biting cold outside held at bay for now. He sat back on his heels, watching them, the woman still unconscious, the baby nestled in her blankets, occasionally whimpering softly. They were here, in his cabin. Two unexpected, unwanted guests who had just shattered the fragile peace of his isolation. He didn't know their language. He didn't know who they were, where they had come from, or why they were alone and exposed in such brutal weather. All he knew was that he had brought them in, and now they were his responsibility. The weight of it settled on him, heavy and unwelcome. He felt a resurgence of the dread, the fear of entanglement, the comfortable numbness of his grief, threatened by the sheer undeniable presence of these two lives. The first day passed in tense silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the soft sounds of the baby. Thomas tended the fire, checked on the woman, and watched. He offered the baby a few drops of water from his fingertip. She reflexively sucked, her tiny mouth a startling pink against her pale skin. He had no milk, nothing else to give her. The woman remained unresponsive, breathing shallowly. Fear gnawed at him. What if she died? What would he do with the baby? Leave her at the settlement? Who would take in a native infant? The prejudice against them was a palpable thing, even stronger than the wind. Towards evening on the second day, the woman stirred. Thomas was sitting across the room, cleaning his rifle, keeping his distance. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and unfocused at first, then sharpening as they scanned the unfamiliar surroundings, landing on him. Fear, raw and immediate, flashed in them. She tried to sit up, a weak, futile movement. "Easy," Thomas said, his voice rough. He spoke slowly, clearly, knowing she might not understand the words, but hoping the tone would convey something other than threat. He gestured towards the blankets, the fire, safety. Her eyes flicked towards the baby, still sleeping soundly beside her. Her hand went instinctively to the small bundle, a fierce protective gesture that spoke volumes without a single word. She pulled the baby closer, her gaze fixed on Thomas, wary and distrustful. He understood that distrust. He was a white man, a stranger, likely seen as part of the world that had driven her to this state. He lowered the rifle deliberately, placing it on the table, trying to project non-aggression. He stood up slowly and went to the small kitchen area. He poured some broth he had made earlier into a bowl and brought it to her. She watched him approach, her eyes tracking his every movement. He knelt a short distance away, offering the bowl. She didn't reach for it. Her gaze was intense, assessing. He saw the exhaustion, the hunger, the pain hidden beneath the surface of her stoicism, and something else, a deep well of grief that mirrored his own. He waited, holding the bowl steady. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken questions and mutual suspicion. Finally, slowly, she reached out a trembling hand and took the bowl. She cupped it, feeling the warmth, but didn't drink immediately. She looked at him again, a question in her dark eyes he couldn't answer with words. He simply nodded, a small, awkward gesture. "Water," he said, pointing to the bucket near the door. "Food." He pointed to the broth. Simple words. Maybe she would understand. She watched him for another long moment, then lowered her gaze to the bowl. She began to sip the broth, slowly at first, then with a little more urgency, though still carefully, as if afraid he might snatch it away. The simple act of drinking, of taking sustenance in his presence, felt like a small, fragile bridge built across the vast chasm between them. Over the next few days the bridge grew, stone by careful stone. Her name, he learned through gestures and a single, soft word, was Nahili. The baby's name was Ayanna, meaning eternal bloom or forever flowering. He wasn't sure which, the word was foreign, but the sound was gentle, hopeful, a stark contrast to the circumstances of her birth. Nahili was weak, still recovering from exposure and whatever ordeal had led to her banishment. She spoke little, her voice soft and hesitant when she did, her language unknown to him except for a few shared words they managed to teach each other through pointing and repetition. The silence in the cabin didn't disappear, but its quality changed. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of grief and isolation, but a quieter, more watchful silence, filled with unspoken questions, cautious observations, and the soft sounds of the baby. Thomas found himself watching Nahili. He saw the quiet strength in her, the fierce, unwavering focus on Ayanna. She tended to the baby with a tenderness that brought an unexpected ache to his chest. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the way she flinched at sudden noises, the deep sadness that sometimes surfaced when she looked out the window at the snow-covered world that had cast her out. He continued to provide firewood, broth, water, a corner of the cabin, safe from the storm outside. He didn't ask questions, sensing the layers of pain and fear she carried. He simply did what needed to be done, and in doing so, in having someone else to care for, even two silent strangers, the suffocating grip of his own grief loosened, just a fraction. He wasn't just living for himself anymore. Nahili, in turn, watched him. She saw the quiet efficiency with which he worked, the loneliness that clung to him like wood smoke. She saw the way his gaze sometimes lingered on Ayanna, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. She saw that he didn't demand, didn't threaten, simply existed alongside them, providing a sanctuary she desperately needed. Her initial fear began to recede, replaced by a cautious gratitude, a fragile sense of safety. They fell into a quiet routine. Thomas worked outside or mended things indoors. Nahili cared for Ayanna. They shared meals in silence, the only sounds the clinking of spoons against bowls, the soft cooing of the baby, the relentless wind outside. The cabin, once a tomb of his memories, now held the faint echo of life, the warmth of another body, the soft presence of a child. It was unsettling, disruptive, and yet there was a strange, tentative comfort in it. He found himself anticipating the sound of Ayanna's soft cries, the small weight of her when Nahili sometimes held her out to him, a silent offering of trust. He learned to hold her, awkward and stiff at first, then with a growing confidence. Her tiny fingers would sometimes curl around his, a touch so feather-light and yet more grounding than anything he had felt in years. He saw Nahili watching him during these moments, a subtle softening in her expression. One evening, as the wind howled particularly fiercely, shaking the cabin walls, Nahili spoke, her voice barely audible above the storm. She gestured vaguely eastward, towards where he had found her. "Tribe," she said, her brow furrowed. "Bad." She touched her stomach, then Ayanna. "Girl, not boy." Understanding dawned, a cold, sickening realization. She had been cast out, banished, for having a daughter. The cruelty of it resonated with him, the harshness of judgment delivered not for a crime, but for simply being. He had faced judgment himself, the whispered accusations from some in the settlement after his family died, as if grief was a contagion, as if his survival was somehow a failure. He understood, in a way words couldn't convey, the weight of being unwanted. He nodded, meeting her gaze. "You stay," he said, simple, direct. He gestured around the cabin. "Safe, here." A flicker of something, hope, relief, crossed her face. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time he saw not just wariness, but a depth of gratitude that humbled him. She nodded slowly, her grip tightening on Ayanna. Their cautious coexistence deepened. He started bringing back small things for Ayanna from his infrequent trips to the settlement, a bit of soft cloth, a carved wooden bird he found forgotten in the general store. He pretended they were necessities, items for the cabin, but Nahili knew, and he knew she knew. These small acts of unexpected kindness chipped away at the walls they had both built around themselves. He learned more about her life through quiet observation and the few fragmented words they shared. She was resourceful, mending her own clothes with surprising skill, noticing things about the land he had overlooked despite years of living on it. She showed him how to make a poultice from dried herbs he had never noticed growing near the creek bed. She taught him a few words of her language, soft sounds that felt strange and warm on his tongue. He, in turn, found himself talking to her, tentatively at first, about the ranch, the weather, the mundane details of his days. He didn't talk about his loss, not directly, but sometimes a silence would fall between them, and he knew she understood the weight of unspoken grief he carried. Her own silence spoke of similar burdens. The winter began to loosen its grip. The days grew longer, the sun warmer, and the snow started to melt in slow, reluctant drips. Ayanna was growing, her eyes bright and curious, her small hands reaching out for the world. She smiled now, a joyous, uninhibited expression that could melt the last remnants of ice from Thomas's heart. Their fragile peace, however, was perched on the edge of a precipice. The melting snow meant travel was easier, and travel meant others might find them. The external threat arrived not with a roar, but with a whisper, a rumor that drifted on the wind from the settlement. Talk of a lost squaw, banished, maybe dangerous, maybe cursed. Talk among men who saw native people not as individuals, but as a problem, an inconvenience, something to be cleared away like brush. Thomas heard it on his next trip for supplies. Men gathered around the stove in the general store, their voices low and hard, speculating, building a narrative of suspicion and fear around the unknown woman and child. He kept his face impassive, bought his supplies, and rode back to the cabin with a knot of dread tightening in his gut. He didn't need to explain much to Nahili. The tension in his shoulders, the grim set of his jaw, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, she understood. The world outside their small sanctuary was dangerous. Her banishment meant she had no place to go back to among her own people, and the white world offered little more than hostility and prejudice. Their isolation, once a source of his pain, was now their only defense. The threat escalated slowly, insidiously. First, there were riders seen on the distant hills, silhouetted against the setting sun, watching. Then a couple of men from the settlement, ostensibly looking for lost cattle, rode close to the cabin, their eyes lingering, assessing. They didn't stop, didn't speak, but their presence was a clear message. You are seen, we know you are here. Thomas knew they wouldn't leave it alone. Prejudice, when given a target, festered. They saw a lone man, living with a native woman and her child, a situation that flew in the face of their narrow world view, challenging their sense of order, their unspoken rules. It was an affront, and they would not stand for it. He spoke to Nahili, using the handful of shared words and many gestures. They, want you, gone." He pointed at himself. "They want trouble." Nahili's face was calm, but her eyes held a deep sadness. She knew this world. She knew the judgment of her own people, and she knew the judgment of the settlers. She was caught between two worlds, welcome in neither. She looked at Ayanna, sleeping peacefully in her makeshift cradle. "Go," she said softly, surprising him with the English word. She gestured towards the west. "Safe, you." He stared at her, stunned. She was offering to leave, to walk back out into the uncertain, dangerous world, to protect him from the repercussions of his kindness. The thought was unbearable. He couldn't send her away. Not now. Not after everything. He shook his head emphatically. "No," he said, his voice firm. "You stay. We stay. Together." It was the first time he had explicitly linked himself and these two strangers. It felt like a commitment, a line drawn in the snow. He spent the next few days preparing. He reinforced the cabin door and windows, checked and cleaned his rifles and pistols, showed Nahili how to load and fire the extra shotgun. She was a quick study, her movements precise and deliberate. He saw the warrior spirit beneath the quiet vulnerability, the deep reserves of strength. The confrontation came on a clear, cold afternoon. 3 riders approached the cabin, not disguised as lost cowhands this time. They rode with purpose, their faces grim, their eyes hard. Cal Brody was in the lead, a man Thomas knew by reputation, loud, cruel, a man who embodied the worst of the settlement's prejudices. The other 2 were his shadows, men who followed his lead without question. Thomas stood on the porch, rifle in hand, Rusty growling softly at his heels. Nahili was inside, the door slightly ajar, Ayanna safely hidden. The riders stopped a short distance away. Cal Brody spat into the dust. "Thomas," he called out, his voice rough. "Heard you got some company." The word was laced with contempt. "They're staying here," Thomas said, his voice level, betraying none of the tension coiled in his gut. "That ain't natural, Thomas," Brody sneered. "A white man and that." He gestured towards the cabin with his chin, a look of disgust on his face. "She's banished, ain't she? Means she's trouble, bad luck. Maybe she ain't even got a right to that child. Heard things." "You heard wrong," Thomas said, tightening his grip on the rifle. "They ain't hurting no one. They're under my roof." "Your roof?" Brody laughed, a harsh, grating sound. His companions chuckled with him. "This ain't your roof no more, Thomas, not if you're gonna harbor vermin." Thomas felt a cold rage spread through him, a fire ignited by Brody's casual cruelty, his dismissive dehumanization of Nahili and Ayanna. It was the same kind of small-mindedness that had fueled the whispers after his own loss, the need to find fault, to blame the victim. He had run from it then, he wouldn't run now. "Get off my land, Brody," Thomas said, his voice low but carrying the weight of absolute finality. Brody's grin faded, his hand hovered near the pistol on his hip. "Think you can tell me what to do, Thomas? Just a sad sack living in a shack with a goddamn squaw?" That did it. The insult wasn't just to him, it was to Nahili, to Ayanna, to the quiet dignity and resilience he had witnessed in them. He raised his rifle slightly, the barrel tracking Brody. "Last chance, Brody," Thomas warned. "Right away, now." Brody's eyes narrowed. He exchanged a look with his men. They were 3 against 1, but Thomas had the advantage of cover and a clear shot. More importantly, Thomas had something they didn't understand, a willingness to defend what was his, not just property, but the fragile, precious connection he had found. He had nothing left to lose, and everything to protect. Brody hesitated, clearly surprised by Thomas's resolve. He had expected the quiet, broken widower to back down, to be shamed or intimidated into compliance. But Thomas was standing taller than he had in years, his gaze steady, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. The standoff stretched, tense and silent save for the wind and Rusty's low growl. Inside, Nahili was silent, a presence Thomas could feel, a silent observer to the test of their sanctuary. Finally, slowly, Brody lowered his hand from his pistol. He stared at Thomas, his eyes filled with frustrated malice. "This ain't over, Thomas," he snarled. "You can't hide 'em forever. The settlement ain't gonna forget this." "Then the settlement will have to remember," Thomas replied, his voice steady. Brody glared, then wheeled his horse around. His men followed, casting backward glances filled with resentment and grudging respect for the man who had dared to stand against them. They rode away, disappearing back towards the settlement, their presence a promise of future trouble, but for now, the immediate threat had receded. Thomas watched them go, his rifle still raised until they were out of sight. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline draining away, leaving him weak and trembling. He lowered the rifle, leaning it against the porch railing, and sank onto the top step, burying his face in his hands. A moment later, the cabin door opened wider. Nahili stepped out, Ayanna clutched in her arms, awake now and whimpering softly. She looked at Thomas, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she came to him. She sat beside him on the step, not speaking, but her presence a solid, comforting weight against his side. Ayanna stirred, turning her head. Her small hand reached out tentatively and patted his cheek. Thomas lifted his head, looking into the wide, innocent eyes of the child, then at the quiet strength in Nahili's face. They were here, they were safe, for now, and he had defended them. He had stood up, not just for them, but for something within himself he had thought long dead. The weight of the confrontation remained, the knowledge that Brody's threat was real, that their peace was precarious. But sitting there, with Nahili beside him and Ayanna's tiny hand on his face, the suffocating weight of his old grief felt lighter. It hadn't vanished, perhaps it never would, but it no longer defined him entirely. There was room for other things now, for quiet companionship, for the fragile warmth of a shared existence, for the fierce, protective love that had bloomed unexpectedly in the frozen landscape of his life. The days that followed were quiet, watchful. Thomas knew the settlers wouldn't forget, but their initial attempt had failed, and perhaps they would wait, or perhaps they would find other ways to make their displeasure known. But for now, there was a reprieve. The world outside continued its slow transformation as spring hesitantly arrived. The snow melted, revealing the brown, muddy earth beneath. Patches of green appeared, tentative and fragile at first, then growing stronger, bolder. The wind softened, losing its cruel, cutting edge. Life was returning to the land. And life was returning to the cabin. Nahili began to move with more freedom, her strength returning. She helped with chores, her movements graceful and efficient, teaching Thomas different ways to manage the small garden plot, ways her people had learned from generations living on this land. They worked side by side, a rhythm developing between them, a quiet understanding that transcended words. Ayanna thrived. She crawled now, a small, determined explorer, filling the cabin with her joyful gurgles and triumphant squeals. Thomas found himself carving small wooden toys for her, simple things, but seeing her delight in them filled him with a quiet joy he hadn't experienced in years. He would watch Nahili with Ayanna, the deep bond between mother and child, and feel a sense of belonging that was both foreign and deeply comforting. One evening, sitting by the fire, the silence was different. Not wary, not tense, but comfortable, shared. Nahili looked at him, her dark eyes soft in the firelight. "Thomas," she said, using his name, which she rarely did. "Thank you." He met her gaze, his own emotions, a complicated tangle he couldn't articulate. Gratitude, affection, a fierce protectiveness that felt startlingly like love. He wasn't sure. "Didn't do much," he mumbled, feeling awkward. "You saved us," she said simply, "gave us home, when no one else would." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Home. It was a word he hadn't used in a long time. This cabin, once just a shelter from the elements and the world, had become something more. It was a place where three disparate souls, cast out and alone, had found refuge together. He looked at Ayanna, sleeping soundly in her cradle, her tiny face angelic. He looked at Nahili, her quiet strength, her unwavering love for her daughter, her unexpected presence in his life. He had been buried in grief, a ghost haunting his own life. They had found him, pulled him out of the snow, back into the world of the living. "This is home," he said, his voice clearer, stronger than it had been in years. He looked at her, a question in his eyes. "For us, for all of us." Nahili's gaze held his. A small smile touched her lips, tentative but real. It was a promise, an acceptance. The prejudice from the settlement didn't vanish entirely. There were still wary looks, whispered words when Thomas went into town, but Brody and his men left them alone after that day. Thomas's quiet defiance had shown them he wasn't an easy target, and perhaps the sight of the grieving widower standing tall, ready to fight for the vulnerable, had given even the most hardened among them pause. Life wasn't easy. The work was hard, the land demanding, and the shadows of the past still lingered, but the cabin was no longer silent. It was filled with the soft sounds of Ayanna, with the quiet rhythm of Nahili's movements, with the low murmur of their shared developing language. Thomas found himself looking forward to coming inside, to the warmth of the fire and the warmth of their presence. He hadn't sought connection, hadn't believed it was possible for him again. He had been isolated by grief, hardened by loss, resigned to a solitary existence. But an unexpected encounter, an act of reluctant kindness born of simple decency, had cracked open the frozen landscape of his heart. He had given refuge to two outcasts, and in doing so, he had found his own way back home. Not to the home he had lost, but to a new one, built on resilience, unexpected kindness, and the quiet, enduring strength of a bond forged in the heart of winter. The prairie wind still howled sometimes, but now, inside the cabin, there was a different sound, the sound of a family, quiet, unconventional, but undeniably whole. It was a sound that promised spring and hope, and a future he had never dared to imagine.